Hi, this is Vincent at Chivalrous Games presenting the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is a Unity asset that creates levels randomly for both 2D and 3D games. Today we are looking at one of the new features that comes out with version 1.1 of the Dungeon Master. It's the Dynamic Navmesh. There are two versions of Dynamic Navmesh supplied with the Dungeon Master. One is a generic solution that you can use anywhere in your project, but not in a dungeon or a level. And the other solution is designed to work with a level inside the Dungeon Master. And the reason there is a difference between these two Navmesh solutions, it's because the level has a renderer that will pop some rooms in and out as you move your character through your dungeon. And the generic Navmesh solution, that wasn't really adapted because it would have recreated Navmesh each time. It wasn't performant enough. So the solution that works with the Dungeon Master will create small nav meshes for each of your room and then attach them together. And it works very well with the dungeon rendering solution. So let's take a look at how it works when it's all completed. I'm just going to press play and you should see the dungeon appear. In the game view, as you can see, I selected the dungeon, so I have a little green box showing where all the possible rooms are gonna appear in this level. And you can see over each room there is a blue overlay that shows the nav mesh. So if I move my character inside the dungeon, you will see that the nav mesh is gonna appear gradually as the rooms get rendered. So I'm just going to move around. Performance may not be perfect since I'm recording at the same time, but as you can see, it works pretty well. If I zoom out, you can see the whole nav mesh around here. So depending on how many rooms you want to display at the same time, you get more or less nav mesh islands at the same time. And you can see it works pretty well. So let's look at the steps to get from a level with no nav mesh to a level with the fully functional nav mesh. Okay, so the first step is to select your level in the editor. For this example, I'm going to work with the village level that is supplied with the Dungeon Master. And it's as simple as extending the generation config over here and clicking Dynamic Navmesh. So the Dungeon Master knows that you want a dynamic navmesh generated for this level. That's all you need to change on your level configuration. And from there you have to configure each room. You have to tag the elements in your room prefab to tell the navmesh that each element should be taken or ignored by the navmesh. So for the example, I'm just going to use one of the prefab that I have for one of the rooms inside the dungeon, and I'm going to cheat a little and only create one element for each tag script that I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to reactivate everything I did so you can see what it looks like when it's completed. Okay, so this is my room prefab. There's only a mesh with a collider over here that serves as the ground. If I expand it, you can see that this is the actual transform with the 3D model and the collider. So I want this part of the room prefab to be taken into the nav mesh. Of course, it's my ground surface. So I'm gonna have to add a little component for the nav mesh to take it into consideration. So I'm clicking on Add Component, and I'm just entering room. And I can type in navmesh, so I only see the room navmesh elements. And for this prefab, I want to use the collider as the real surface of the navmesh. So I simply click on room navmesh collider, and that's it. Now when the navmesh is dynamically generated, it's going to take this mesh collider and use it as a surface. And I can tell the navmesh which kind of surface this is. And this can be a walkable, not walkable, or a jump surface. This is all the navmesh area that you defined in your Unity navmesh system. So I won't go into detail because all of this information is available on the Unity website. I'm simply using it. There's nothing new about this. So let's say that this is an area where my NavMesh agent or AI should be able to walk, so I'm just clicking on walkable. This could work also with another tagging component because we have a mesh filter, so we could prefer to use a mesh filter rather than a collider. So since I have both, I could decide to go with the NavMesh mesh tag element, and this one is using the NavMesh filter rather than the NavMesh collider. For this example, it doesn't change anything, but if you have an element with a collider but no mesh filter, then of course you use the Room NavMesh collider, and vice versa. So for this example, I'm just going to remove this and go back with the NavMesh collider. Okay, so now I have to do scenery in my room. I want to put some elements, so I'm just gonna make a fence appear. So of course my character shouldn't be able to walk through the fence. So what I'm doing is I'm just gonna expand this. Now it already has its collider element, but it's exactly the same principle than it is for the surface over here. So you simply add a NavMesh collider, and when the NavMesh gets created, it's gonna determine that this is a walkable area, but the fence over here is not walkable. So it's gonna chop out a little part of the NavMesh, so your NavMesh AI agents won't be able to go through the fence. But I would like my NavMesh agents to be able to jump over the fence. So I'm going to add another element. If I expand, oh okay, I already have it here. I can put in another element, and this is a Room NavMesh link. You can use the Room NavMesh links to create links between two parts of the same NavMesh. Like this is a great example because I don't want my NavMesh agent to go through the fence, but I want it to jump over it. So I'm created a link that connects the same NavMesh over here and over here. And this is pretty easy to configure. You simply determine which NavMesh agents should be able to use the link. And just like the NavMesh area, the agent types are defined in the Unity documentation. I'm simply reusing it. Then you determine what is the start position for your link, and you can enter values or simply drag and drop, and you can see inside the game view that the link is modified as I move this. And it's the same principle for the end position. The other part is moving around. And then you can swap these over and align on your transform. These are just shortcut buttons. You can determine the width of your link, so it gets easier to reach for your NavMesh agent. And you have to be careful when you want to make a bigger width, because this will affect where your agent will enter the link. So if I use a wide link like this, my agent could begin his jump right here, or right there, or right there, but it's gonna always jump over to the end position. So even if he jumps over here, it's not gonna move right through, it's gonna jump and over here. So if you want multiple end points for your jump, then you should have multiple links rather than a single wide one. It all depends on what you want to achieve. You can determine if the link has to be bidirectional. This means that your NavMesh agent could go and use the link from both sides. For the fence, it's great. It's what we want. But if we were creating some sort of a jump down position from a high ledge, like so, if I raise the jump, then maybe I would want my NavMesh agent to be able to walk on a platform here and jump down, but you wouldn't be able to jump up. So that kind of link wouldn't be bidirectional. I'm gonna reset this. And just like for the NavMesh surface, you can determine what kind of area type this jump should be considered a part of. And you have the option to track the NavMesh link. If you activate this and during the game you move the, for example, the whole fence around, then the nav mesh will get recreated, and the link will be moved, so you can really have a dynamic solution for moving your elements around. But of course, you have to keep in mind that if you use the track nav mesh link option, then you're gonna get a performance hit, because it's gonna monitor how the link is moved or modified, and then it's gonna recreate the nav mesh each time. So you gotta be careful with that. There's another thing I have to explain about nav mesh links. It's that since each room has its own little nav mesh, you have to connect each of the nav mesh rooms through nav mesh links. And the best way to do that in the Dungeon Master is to use the connectors, because when a room spawns in the level, it will spawn with connectors, of course, to connect to other rooms, and you can reuse this and simply put your nav mesh links inside your connectors. So, as you can see, I have a nav mesh connector here that is part of the room connector, and you simply add this nav mesh link to your connector, and when it gets spawned, of course you put one side of the connector on your room and the other side would be toward nothing, and when the other room spawns, then the nav mesh link detects the other nav mesh, and then the link is created between the two rooms. Okay, so now we have seen the nav mesh, the room nav mesh link, the room nav mesh collider, and the room nav mesh mesh. There's also other elements that you can use, like terrains. I don't want to use a terrain for this room, but I'm gonna show it to you anyway. Okay, no, of course it's over here. Create terrain, 3D object, and I want a terrain. Okay, so we have a terrain right here. And I could of course use the tools to work with it, so we can raise some ground, move it around, whatever. And when you put this terrain inside your room as a child transform, just gonna go back to the top right here. It's the same idea that with the other tagging components. So you simply add a component and said you want to use a room nav mesh terrain. And just like the collider or the mesh, you determine what type of area it should be a part of. But I don't want it to rain inside my room, so I'm just going to delete it. And go back over here. Okay, of course, all the elements in your room might not be a part of your nav mesh. For example, I have some grass model inside my room. If I reactivate it and zoom in, then you can see that I have a lot of little grass model, and this should be ignored by the nav mesh because my agent should be able to walk through and not be blocked by the grass. So if I simply don't put any room nav mesh element, then it's going to be ignored, and it doesn't exist as far as the nav mesh agent knows. Okay, let's look at the other elements. I still have the primitive and the modifier box to show you. The primitive, usually use this when you want to add an element to your nav mesh, but you don't necessarily want to base it on a collider or a mesh or a terrain. So for this example, I just added an empty game object, and I'm going to add a room nav mesh primitive element. So you determine the area, just like the other nav mesh elements, and you determine what kind of primitive you want to use to add to your nav mesh. If you need information on how each of these elements works, you can refer to the Unity documentation. So let's say I want to add a box to my nav mesh. I simply determine the size of the box. This is going to be a very huge box. Okay, so as you can see, this would create another part to my nav mesh. So since the box is going through my collider over here, then it's gonna probably create a surface around here. Then it's gonna be blocked by the sides of the primitive, and the top of the primitive is gonna be another area you can walk on. So you can use this to create obstacles or invisible walls or things like that that you don't want your agent to go through. Okay, I'm gonna remove this and I'm just gonna add last element. This is the modifier box, and you define it pretty much like you define a box primitive. So you create the area, and this modifier box is used to change the navmesh area of the elements that it contains. So for example, over here, my surface is considered a walkable area. But if, for example, I wanted to create an area that should be considered like difficult terrain, because I don't know, I could put a texture of mud or water or something. So it's still the same collider, but the behavior of the navmesh agent that goes through this differently textured area should be altered. So what I'm telling the modifier box over here is that this navmesh area of my collider should not be considered walkable, but, for example, not walkable. So if I have I don't know, a navmesh agent that is afraid of water, it would move around the modifier box to avoid the water area contained inside of here. Of course, if you use another 3D model to define your water area, then maybe the modifier box is not necessary. You could create another navmesh mesh tagging component or collider tagging component. So it's really just a set of tools that you can use however you want to create your navmesh. Okay, so I'm just gonna revert my room over here so it all gets restored. And as you can see, I have a lot of fences with jumpable area, with navmesh links, and I've got colliders on my trees, so the navmesh AI could go through, for example, the leaf of the tree, but could not go through the trunk, and I've got rocks and everything. Now, I could simply leave it like this and it would work perfectly, as long as my room has all the tagging components and my level generation config uses the dynamic navmesh, then it will work. But you can enhance the performance by adding an element to your room. So my room prefab is done. I can remove it. I'm gonna remove this component and redo the configuration for you. I'm just clicking on this and my room navmesh manager script appears on the room. I can enhance the performance of the dynamic navmesh creation by adding a room navmesh manager. So this is not mandatory, it's all optional, but it's going to help you get a better performance. Now you can prepare the navmesh for the specific room in advance by baking it, and this is what will give you a great performance boost. Now my park room here is related to my room prefab over here, of course. So park, and you can see it uses this room prefab, and this room prefab has all the tagging elements to determine what goes in and what doesn't go into the navmesh. So if I click on my park room and click bake, it's going to collect all the tagging elements which are considered navmesh sources, and it's going to display it here. And if I now expand my room inside the editor, you can see that there's a baked navmesh data over here. If I had multiple agents, it would create a baked navmesh for each of my my AI agents. If I want to remove the baked navmesh, of course, I could simply click on clear and it's gone over here. So if I want to modify my room prefab, I can go back and recreate it, bake it, like this. What you can do with this room navmesh manager is determine if the whole room navmesh should be tracked for changes during runtime. This is exactly like the link that I explained before. If you click on the track navmesh option, the dungeon is gonna track all changes done to your room navmesh. So you could, for example, change your colliders or your meshes during runtime, and the navmesh would adapt to closely resemble all the changes you apply. But as for the link, if you click on this option, then you get a performance hit, because all this tracking and rebuilding of navmesh has a cost, of course. I also want to show you what happens when you decide to use a track navmesh option. So let's say, for example, that I want this room, the park, to have a tracked nav mesh. So I'm gonna stop the game right now. I'm gonna expand, go back to my park room, and decide that this one should track the nav mesh. So if I hit play, I regenerate my dungeon, the nav mesh for this park room is going to be tracked. So if I select, for example, the ground, which has a room nav mesh collider, and I decide to move it around, up or down, you can see that the nav mesh gets updated. When it gets near obstacles, it carves out little parts of the nav mesh around the fences and trees. And if I raise it up, then you can see that everything disappears. It's going to follow what changes I apply to my room nav mesh. And by opposition, if I go to this room, which has no tracked nav mesh, and I move the same object around, you see that the nav mesh remains unchanged. Another interesting thing to look at when you work with NavMesh is, of course, to use a NavMesh agent. This is the AI character that's going to move around on your NavMesh. So when you use a dynamic NavMesh provided with the Dungeon Master or the generic one, you can always use the default NavMesh agent that is supplied with Unity. But I created a small helper script that is called a NavMesh dynamic agent. And you could put this on your character in your project file. So if I'm going to find my character, you see I have my NPC 3D, and it simply has the NavMesh dynamic agent script. And what this does is basically when the agent gets created in the game, it's going to try to place it on the NavMesh. But since the NavMesh is dynamic, you don't exactly know when it's going to appear. So this script is going to keep looking for the NavMesh, and when it appears, it's going to generate the Unity NavMesh agent. And you can use some callback functions in your scripts to configure this the way you want. So basically I just hit play, and my little NPC character is going to appear in the dungeon right over there. And you can see that if I select this character, now the NavMesh agent is generated by the dynamic agent. So it's not mandatory, but I like it. I think it helps. So that's about it. That's how it works. So to recap, you simply click on your level to get the dynamic NavMesh option. Then you set your tagging scripts on the elements of your room that you want to use in the dynamic NavMesh. And then you can bake some NavMeshes in your room to get performance boost. And finally you simply hit play, and that's it. You can move your character around and use a NavMesh. So I hope this tutorial video on the dynamic NavMesh for the Dungeon Master has been helpful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will answer them either on the Chivalrous Game website or the Unity forums. So have fun with the Dungeon Master.